Welcome to Parallax, the podcast series hosted by the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. I am Tanvi Kulkarni, and today's Parallax conversation is called Nuclear Women. I have with me two experts in the field of nuclear policy analysis and research, Dr. Jayita Sarkar and Ruhee Neog. And we are going to be talking about how we locate ourselves as women professionally and academically and engage with international and national security research generally and nuclear issues specifically. Just to briefly introduce my co-discussants here, Jayita teaches diplomatic and political history at Boston University's Pardee School of Global Studies. Her expertise is in 20th century South Asia, the history of US foreign relations, nuclear technologies, and connected partitions. Jayita's first book, Plowshares and Swords, India's Nuclear Program in the Global Cold War, is under contract to be published by Cornell University Press. And she's currently an Ernest May Fellow and a Weatherhead Initiative on Global History Fellow at Harvard to work on her second book. What's going on there, Jayita? Ruhee is the director of the New Delhi-based think tank and research organization, the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies. She works on nuclear policy and strategy, particularly as they pertain to Southern Asia. More broadly, her research looks at the role of norms and institutions in determining choices and behaviors in international relations. Ruhee also lectures on foreign policy and the links with intelligence at the Ministry of Home Affairs Central Detective Training School. Jayita is joining us from Brookline near Boston. Is that correct, Jayita?
I'm joining you from my university campus, so it is technically Boston. Not Brookline, tiny city.
All right. So Jayita is joining us from Boston in the United States, and Ruhee from Delhi, and I from Pune. Jayita and Ruhee, welcome.
Thank you.
So I'm absolutely thrilled to be talking to you on a topic that is almost always at the back of my mind as a professional and as a researcher on nuclear issues. While the conversation about how women are represented and impacted by security discourses is fairly an old one, I think it remains an ongoing one. National security discourses in most places around the world are still male-dominated, right? With the lack of gender parity. And this is perhaps more so when it comes to discourses around strategic issues, arms, weapons, technologies, and policies. There are certainly a lot more women working in security policy now than ever before, but the gender picture remains far from balanced. Particularly the dearth of women is especially seen in and felt in foreign and security policy leadership positions. Jayita, I want to start by asking you, how critical is the gender perspective in the field of nuclear policy? And if I may just add, how do women contribute to the nuclear and security paradigm?
Absolutely, that's an excellent question to start the conversation. I think the perspective of gender is extremely important in nuclear policy because there is so much at stake, right? The moment you're talking about nukes, whether it's technology or however you're only talking about weapons, there's always this mushroom cloud, right? This is why we have been taught that the Cold War is different because of nuclear weapons, which means there's so much at stake. So if there is so much at stake, something as significant as gender definitely needs to be foregrounded because there is so much at stake. So my perspective is that, yeah, the field of the field of nuclear policy should definitely incorporate not just more women, but women with newer perspectives. Because as women, we are able to see the gendered power structures better, right? Because of our identity. And identity, as we know, is intersectional, so we can see the invisibilities of power structures better. So to make those power structures visible through our work, whether it's our research or whether it's our teaching. So I think there is a lot that women can contribute meaningfully, and it's actually necessary because, in my classroom, my nuclear politics class is almost always full, and it's about 40 students, and it's a lot for an elective, and 90% are women, right? And because that's what liberal arts education looks like in the United States, also in India, as far as I was studying. Right? And so these women are taking nuclear politics class and they want to be part of that conversation. They have a lot to say, and they have a lot of meaningful contributions to make. So I think it's not just us who are in the field, but also the next generation. We need to incorporate perspectives and people to make this a more vibrant field, so that the knowledge production that we are making is pushed forward. Right? Otherwise, we're just going to be 1960s nuclear deterrence, rand. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, Ruhee, do you agree that is it that women bring something new to the table, something different to the table, or this is sort of a very stereotypical way of looking at women's contribution, and there's definitely more and beyond to women's participation in this field?
Well, let me begin by saying that Jayita has put it also eloquently, that I don't have any sort of brilliant follow-up to that. But I think what will be interesting to also discuss is, the way the field itself is very heavily gendered. So, how we construct masculine and feminine discourses, and how this might box us in terms of perspectives, in terms of binaries, in terms of the way we describe masculine and feminine attributes, and then how we, have that shape the security field more broadly. And in that regard, I think the discussion can even go beyond the representation of women to also looking much more broadly, or perhaps even actually much more specifically, at how both men and women can find themselves sort of navigating, this binary space of either subscribing to a set of masculine notions or subscribing to a set of feminine notions. And I think one of the fields where it stands out very clearly, as you pointed out, Tanvi, is the nuclear field. So you have, of course, the block that looks at nuclear deterrence, and I call it a block because also it is sort of distinguished within the field, and those that look at issues like arms control and disarmament. So, you might be cognitively conditioned into seeing one as more masculine than the other. So I would actually go so far as to say that this has perhaps less to do with men and women and more to do with the attributes, or the attributes we have come to assign to masculinity and femininity. And the way we then very exclusively tie masculinity with the male and femininity with the female. I know perhaps it's not even clear in my own head, and I'm not sure I'm being able to describe it properly, but I think this sort of binary also, prohibits creative thinking. So it's not just bringing more women to the table, but it's the ability to open the room up to a whole set of perspectives that may not subscribe to traditional schools of thought. Perhaps that's where I'll end this bit.
So taking on exactly from that point that you made, Ruhee, we often and traditionally characterize nuclear issues, whether it's strategy, technology, or policy, as intrinsically or inherently masculine, because they fall within the larger domain of strategic and military issues. I think this portrayal then tends to generate an imposter syndrome for women working and researching on these issues, which then sometimes might translate into a struggle to fit into what is often called as a men's club or a boys' club. Does this somewhere go back to how we study the subdiscipline of international security and nuclear weapons within it? Whether issues of gender in security studies are taught and learned through certain stereotypes, whether feminist perspectives are included very peripherally in our course syllabi. So coming to think of it, I'm wondering whether some of the challenges with regards to the gender approach that we face in our workplaces or in our seminar halls or even in our policy circles really stem from our university curriculums. And both of you, I know, have had an experience in the Indian as well as the foreign higher education systems. What's been your experience, Jayita?
Excellent question, Tanvi, an excellent intervention, Ruhee. Can I just respond to what Ruhee said, because she raised this really important, interesting point about, who works on nuclear deterrence, who works on nuclear proliferation and who works on arms control and disarmament? Who are these people, and what kinds of identities do they consider their own, and how does that impact their research, right? And it's fascinating because, this earlier this spring, I had a guest speaker in my nuclear politics class, and we were discussing just this, that when we look at a nuclear deterrence literature, it is full of white, cis males who are really taking on from the 1960s, Rand Corporation's models of, first strike, second strike, survivability, all of that. It's a very Cold War model that is continuing. It's just, it's certainly there is a little more mixed methods added to it. Go to the archive, find like one document that proves your hypotheses, and you're a historically minded political scientist. But I'll keep that rant aside. But we find that there's that angle to it, like who is working more on nuclear deterrence and who is working more on nuclear proliferation. And this also lets me answer your question, Tanvi, that when I was a student in the Department of International Relations at Jadavpur in Kolkata, I never thought I was going to be this nuclear woman, because my curriculum involved nuclear deterrence and MERV. And I'm not going to name my professor, he was brilliant, but his eyes would lit up when he talked about MERV. And my heart would sink thinking about MERVs, because this MERV that, multiple independently targeted reentry vehicle target so many targets was like one warhead, and that's not cool. There's so many people are going to die. So I thought that was just horrible. And my work is not deterrence. My work is nuclear proliferation and non-proliferation. And I look at technologies and politics. I do look at high politics, quote unquote, because a lot of that is, these are elite actors, whether scientists or diplomats. But the fact that, I as a woman found nuclear deterrence conversations alienating to me. I did well in the class, like a good Indian kid. You do what your parents tell you, you get good grades and you get up. But it was very demoralizing. But that is, I'm giving my example to make my first point about who's working on what really matters, and how our gender, even though I struggle to find women actors in my research, right? My first book is on India's program. There aren't a lot of women, right? If I were working on anti-nuclear activism, say if I were working on uranium mining, then I will find women actors, because female actors are feminine actors, because they are powerless, right? The moment you're studying power structures and you're looking from the perspective of power, you don't find a lot of women. And this is also the case of the field. You're going to find a lot of women who are doing wonderful work and are at the top. So we have so little to learn from, so little guidance, and all three of us are just kind of figuring it out as we go along. But the fact that we're having this conversation means that these kinds of networking is helping, that we're learning from each other at the same time. I don't know if that answered your question, but I can try again.
No, I mean, it does. But same question to you, Ruhee. And if I may just add to that a little bit, in the US, where Jayita teaches and researches, we see that this conversation is still very sophisticated and fairly seriously pursued. While you're answering, could you also tell us whether this conversation in India and in Southern Asia is very nascent?
I would have used that exact word, actually, which is that it's very nascent. In fact, I would say, and Tanvi, I'd like to know how you think of this as well, which is, let's say about 5 to 6 years ago, I mean, we've inhabited this field for quite some time now. We weren't thinking about these issues, but you realize now the subconscious ways in which you were still imbibing these binaries and structures of power and functioning along expected pathways, right? I feel like, the so-called superiority of nuclear deterrence, for instance, in the hierarchy of the several subfields within nuclear and within the nuclear domain, I feel like that hierarchy would have constructed itself pretty automatically within, our psychology. And here the point Jayita raised about language becomes so pertinent, because, you encounter technical terminology aside, you also encounter a lot of jargon that I find is exclusionary, right? It is, I would say, whether consciously or subconsciously, an exercise of a kind of linguistic elitism that keeps people out, which is why you find that I feel like those who inhabit the nuclear field more broadly, and I'm sure this is obviously not deliberate, it tends to be a little bit cut off from other fields of study, even within the think tank space, right? There is also, a lot of this language, and I've used this in a piece of writing I did some time ago. It tends to invoke a sense of alpha maleness. So, to your point, Tanvi, about the possibility of an imposter syndrome setting in, I think a lot of us go through it at different points in our careers, also because I think you begin to think that perhaps, or at least the field that you occupy, you see that security speak perhaps is assumed to be more natural to men, certainly the men who've worn uniforms in the past. And then the rest of us, those who are women or those who are perceived outsiders, have to sort of nurture themselves into the field. So I feel like there is that distinction. And of course, you learn and unlearn and then, find a way forward for yourself. But this language and the way we encounter it, whether in how we are trained in the education system or how we practice policy research within think tanks, all of that comes together to shape our orientation also a certain way. So a certain degree of unlearning and relearning, once you acknowledge that this exists, takes time, but it's important.
Just to speak of my own experience, you asked, Ruhee. There's an interesting incident that happened about 10 years ago when I was just starting out as a professional in this field. And I remember at a seminar, an Australian woman walked up to me and she asked if I had any idea about gender perspectives and particularly women's perspectives on nuclear issues coming from India, any kind of literature that I could point her to. And honestly, that was a really strange question for me at that point. Not so much because there was no conversation around this theme, but just as someone who was starting out in the field, I could actually see just a lot of women around me in colleges, at universities, who were part of studies on hardcore security issues and on nuclear politics. For me, I think this conversation about gender perspectives came fairly late, actually fairly recently, in the last few years. And like you said, a lot of it has been because of a lot of learning and unlearning about how the field itself is structured. One of the things that I realized was also how feminist perspectives were taught to us at the graduate level, and it's only something that I acquired through self-learning at later stages at the university. Just to point out another instance, when we study nuclear behaviors of, say, India and Pakistan, there's a fairly well-established and systematic study on looking at India and Pakistan as post-colonial countries, and analyzing nuclear behaviors rooted in their post-colonial identities. I actually find it very hard to find similar systematic literature on looking at India and Pakistan's nuclear behaviors or policies through, say, a gender prism. That sort of that sort of brings me back to Jayita. Jayita, your research is at the intersection of security studies and also post-colonialism. How does your identity as a woman then shape your research? And it'll be interesting if you speak especially of the global decolonization initiative that you run from your university.
Yeah, sure. So let me put it this way. So the book, Plowshares and Swords, is really about the first 40 years of India's nuclear program, which includes the first nuclear explosion of 1974. And it is really a work of history. And this is how I'm going to answer your question, is that I think, my master's was in international relations, and apart from JNU, Jadavpur is the other place in India where you can get an IR degree. But after that, I got disillusioned with IR. My apologies to you guys. And I decided to become a historian. And one of the reasons I did that is because I found these theory-driven perspectives very constraining. Not only is there no space for a gender perspective, but also it's very constraining. And I felt like this is not the kind of knowledge I want to produce because it doesn't make me happy. I just don't think I can push it far enough. And as a result, it is really at the intersection of various kinds of history. So it's diplomatic and political history, which I'm probably better at, and history of technology, which I am okay at. So that's why it's a combination of diplomatic history, so geopolitics, as well as technopolitics from the history of technology perspective. But given my immersion in international relations, I'm very much aware of the theories. I teach IR majors in Boston University, so I'm very much aware of the IR debates and who the authors are. So I'm happy to talk about the contribution of that book. But I would not really call my work rooted in post-colonial studies, because post-colonial studies itself recognizes how language has created this hierarchy, which is very Eurocentric or Euro-American, if you will, and as a result has come up with its own vocabulary. And it is really wonderful what they're doing, but that's not the perspective I'm taking. So I just wanted to make sure that you understand that. But I do consider colonialism and decolonization as pivotal for the understanding of the nuclear program, because it happens around the same time, right? And it's the Board of Atomic Energy Research exists in 1946. India is not yet independent. The map of India we don't really know, but we still know there's monazite in Travancore, right? So I think decolonization is pivotal to understanding India's nuclear program, the early years and then onward. The second question is about the initiative. The initiative is something that I'm really proud of, primarily because of my students who are doing wonderful work. And it has a nuclear aspect to it. And that actually connects to many of the things we're talking about. It has a nuclear sites project. And the nuclear sites project is basically developing case studies. So my student research interns are developing case studies on various nuclear sites, broadly defined. They could be testing sites. They could be uranium mining sites. They could be nuclear reactor site, and look at radiation poisoning, radioactivity related illnesses on the people. So really foregrounding the human, which is what we don't do enough, and which is also why a lot of the gendered perspectives is missing, because it is about prioritization of power, right? And so we find more women when we look at radiation illness, right? Things like that, or anti-nuclear activism, because that's we're studying the powerless there, or the less powerful. So my students are developing these case studies, which the goal is I'm going to use them in my class. So it's like I'm creating an entire cycle here that students who have taken my class already know the invisibility, because they have studied nuclear deterrence, nuclear proliferation, all the stuff that I've taught them, because they have to start with a base, right? And then they recognize that, we don't know enough about nuclear testing in the Xinjiang province of China, but then isn't it strange that Lop Nor is also in Xinjiang province, which is where all the repression is happening of the Muslim minority? What is going on? And I have students working on, French testing in Algeria. Once again, Algeria became independent, but the French were still testing there. It's crazy, right? So there's a very racialized angle to the choice of nuclear sites. And it's in some cases, women are becoming more visible in those case studies. In some cases, it's harder to find data. Once again, if you're studying the less powerful, it's harder to find data. It's so much easier to study the how more powerful, right? Because they write what they do because they want to control the narrative after they're gone and when they're around. So that's what the Nuclear Sites Project do, is really developing these case studies. And the thing is, students are earnest because they have taken the class. They know the invisibility. They know what we don't know. And they're becoming part of the solution. So they are excited. I'm excited. And I'm so proud of them. So that's how I'm trying to, do my little bit and like push the conversation forward. and not just complain.
That's absolutely brilliant. And I thought you brought a very pertinent point here, and that is, when we're studying these issues from the human perspective, as you put it, even when we're talking about gender, we often forget that identities are intersectional, right? So, we end up boxing also gender perspectives into strict boxes, not realizing that they cross-cut across race and other identities that sort of also affect the issues that we're talking about. And the initiative sounds just absolutely wonderful, and good luck. And in fact, I was following your website and it looks brilliant.
Thank you.
Ruhee, you had a think tank that runs various programs, one of which is the Nuclear Security Program. How do you build the gender question when you design your projects and the research at your institute? And actually, even in your own research and policy analysis?
So first, I want to just say, Jayita, that I want to be sitting in this class and working on this nuclear sites project with you. And I really want to be taught by you now. This sounds really exciting. And your whole point about how this then exposes vulnerabilities and powerlessness ties back to, we didn't call it intersectionality right at the beginning, but I think that is what we were trying to arrive at. And it reveals just how instrumental an intersectional approach can be to understanding, how vulnerabilities can interact and disadvantage a person or a group of people. So in terms of, how we do things at IPCS, I will be very honest, as I was saying earlier, this is a relatively new area of study in India. I won't even call it an area of study, actually. People are just beginning to discuss it a little bit more threadbare than earlier. It is just beginning to go past superficialities. I think where it has been evident for some time, I can't speak to how other organizations are run, but certainly within IPCS, is how we have these conversations within, colleagues. We talk about language, particularly language, not just as it operates within the nuclear field, but within the security field more generally. And look at how that impacts how we understand concepts and the use of those concepts, war fighting jargon, etc. What is interesting to me, what has been interesting from a very personal point of view, is being very often, because of the leadership position that you pinpointed, Tanvi, in rooms that are mostly populated by much older men. So what also becomes relevant here is age, not just, the fact of my being a woman. In fact, I will say that given the several kinds of privilege that I have had access to, at no point in my career or through my education, and I speak exclusively for myself, have I felt disadvantaged, professionally, obviously more broadly, not just speaking about nuclear weapons research. But what starts playing perhaps a more important role is age. And that, across Asia, you have cultural hierarchies that are built on the basis of age. So when age and the sort of issues that you work on and the sort of people you have to interact with because of the position you occupy, when those come together, I will say that it makes for a very interesting experience. I'm not saying it necessarily makes for a negative experience, but I always come back with a lot of mental notes that often have nothing to do with the substance of the meeting itself.
Mm-hmm.
Mm. So you're coming to the question of, so what do we do about bringing, women's perspectives in our field of work? I've often heard two things very popularly. First is the issue of representation. That is to say, we need to have more women participating in the security discourse. And second, that we need to increase more thematic discussions around gender and nuclear issues. And these are pertinent solutions. But I also feel that we sort of, also get confused between the means and the ends, and sometimes the means sort of become the end. So the common pitfall to this could be that, simply talking to women or having a thematic discussion around women is sort of taken to mean as incorporating the gender approach. As a result, we don't end up paying attention to a more layered problem at hand. For instance, a lot of times, as you pointed, seminar agendas are designed in a way that sort of relegates women to talk about only specific issues like humanitarian discourse or disarmament or arms control. Or you'd have, conferences where there will be that one all-woman panel, which sort of becomes the statement on gender. Okay, but it's basically women talking to women, right? So, I mean, I remember a few years back when Ruhee and I wrote an article on the theme of women in nuclear weapons related studies. Jayita made a very important observation as a comment to that piece. Jayita, you indicated that, and I'm paraphrasing you here, that often there is an assumption that women's perspectives on nuclear issues are monolithic. And that's certainly not true. In fact, women sort of get slotted into then extreme positions, either as proponents of muscle flexing military policy or as being disarmament doves. What I want to ask both of you is that how do we come out of these constructed binaries, something that Ruhee was pointing out, and then create a more meaningful space where women can contribute in diverse ways, more innovatively to research, policy, and the security discourse more generally? Jayita?
Yeah, I think it's really an important question, and I think it ties very well with what Ruhee had said about age, right? That if you look at the New Delhi think tank circle, or you look at the Washington DC, the Beltway think tank circle, it's like wise old men telling us what to do, right? But then when we look at, and this came up once again in my class, like these brilliant students, they really pushed me to think out of the box. We were looking at, who are the people who really pushed for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in terms of activism, whether it's Geneva, whether it's New York, at the UN level, really making that change happen, right? They're a bunch of millennials, all right? They're a bunch of millennials. So I think there is something to be said. I mean, yes, so there's clearly a power hierarchy in terms of gender, in terms of race. There is a power hierarchy in terms of age. But at the same time, we do see tangible change. Now, yes, am I an idealist? Am I assuming that all the countries will sign the treaty? No. But the fact that there is a treaty out there that happened that 5-6 years back, people said, peace mix, here they come again. But that we can't say that anymore, right? And the main actors who were really acting for this treaty are just really, millennials. Most of them are younger Gen Xers, maybe, but mostly. So I think there is reason to hope for real tangible change. From this age difference that is coming out. There's a different perspective looking at nuclear weapons, who did not grow up in the Cold War or did not even hear stories about it, right? They have a different perspective. Why do we have them? What purpose do they serve? Do they produce energy, but it's not safe because of radiation, right? So that myth from 1953, from Eisenhower onward, that this electricity will be too cheap to meter is a myth. We still know that, but at the same time, we still have actors who are powerful harp on that myth, right? So to the younger generation, that makes no sense. So we're seeing a lot of change from that perspective, and I think we need to account for that. When I first started teaching this class, I did not discuss the treaty because it has just come out, and I was not sure how it's going to fit in my syllabi. And then I'm like, that's a perspective I'm missing out on and making my students miss out on. We have to discuss it. We have to discuss this fully. And then we have this new understanding that there is a different age group pushing for that change and materializing that change. How cool is that? So I think I went on a tangent with my excitement. Can you repeat the other question you had?
I was asking, I mean, how do we get out of these binaries that are sort of constructed and then, move towards a space that allows women and younger women especially to sort of contribute more innovatively to the discourse?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that needs to happen. People like us who are teaching in the classroom with our syllabi, people like, Ruhee, who is mentoring a lot of young women, I'm sure at IPCS, perhaps, circulate certain reading materials that's going to challenge the binaries. In my own experience, I was a grad student in Geneva, and I was very excited to get accepted at this nuclear boot camp, which is like this history boot camp. And it was really cool. Like, I'm sure you know a bunch of people who've been there. And I think it was 2011 or something. And I had this very quirky, but a very good friend of mine in Geneva who sent me this article by Carol Cohn, Sex, Death in the Rational World of Defense Intellectuals, right? I'm sure most of us have read it, from 1987, right? Published in the Science Feminist Journal. And she basically discussed exactly what Ruhee talked about jargon, right? This jargon that the field has come up with that is very alienating, right? And we see Carol Cohn discuss that in 87. And at the same time, because we work in this field, we know that not much has changed, right? We still hear the same terms. Make the students or your mentees discuss this and see like what little tweaks can I do in my own research, in the way I ask questions, in the way I am little changes can go far if they are long enough, right? It doesn't have to be overturning everything, because then you don't know what the next outcome will be. So you can say I'm not a revolutionary, but I do believe in change. So I think I would say, making them discuss, not just read passively, but discuss. Like, what did you get out of this? And make them connect other ideas. If they're not taking class, but they're definitely doing interviews with, policymakers, and they're seeing this hierarchy that Cohen is talking about in their life, in that interview, right? Make them training them to be more self-conscious, and conscious of the power hierarchy that is around us is probably the best or the first way forward. I also see there's this really interesting article that came out in a very brief Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, August this year. It was called, calling for an anti-racist action and accountability in the nuclear field. I'm butchering the title, but it's written by a group of brilliant young women who are really challenging the binaries, and they raise excellent questions. They're talking about, how the field, if you look at not just deterrence, if you look at nuclear targeting, which is deterrence, part of it at least, that, we want to have a plan if the nuclear deterrence fails. You got to have like targeting plans. If you look at nuclear targeting, if you look at nuclear testing sites, which brings my nuclear sites project, and nuclear proliferation, there is this racialized vision of the other, right? Like, oh, the rogue states are going to get nuclear weapons. Take for the example, 1998, India and Pakistan testing, right? I'm not saying that was the right thing to do or the bad or a good thing to do, but the fact that there were these nuclear tests in South Asia, all of a sudden people lost their mind, thinking that these, irrational countries that certainly don't have the same command and control structure will just, go kaboom. Well, we did have a Kargil war, but that was not a nuclear war. But the amount of fear and paranoia is something to contend with, right? So if you look at who is the other, whether it's nuclear targeting, right? There was this article I think most of us have read by Scott Sagan and Ben Valentino that most U.S. People in the U.S. are totally okay using nuclear weapons against Iran, right? But then there's also this racialized vision of the other that applies to Iran, as we know, as a Muslim country, right? As the vision of 1979, Islamic Revolution, Iran hostage crisis, it's a very much a racialized other. So to recognize these power hierarchies that exist and to foreground them, right? We don't have to have like what happened at least during my education in India, and I think I can say perhaps just the diplomatic history field is not exactly not hyper-masculine, just so you know. History also had constraints. Is that this feminist perspective is like comes at the very end, right? Like, because you have to do it. It's like one little discussion because you just want to do it. You have to do it. So that should not be the perspective. It should be like, this is it, right? This is part of it. And it helps us make the world, it helps us understand the world better, all right? So we're going to foreground this. So I think foregrounding is important, and then going from there instead of this last adding as an afterthought.
I absolutely agree with you. Foregrounding, the classroom being one of the most important spaces to start this change, to initiate the change, and to sort of roll ball this change is important. And you also say that it's important for us to account for perspectives. First, to acknowledge that there are multiple perspectives which are not monolithic, which cut across identities, and then to account for those perspectives. For instance, when we're talking about women missing in leadership roles, there are plenty of women actually in Southern Asia who are in leadership roles in anti-nuclear activism, for instance. So while we are talking about missing leadership in policy circles, there's an entire group of women who are leading a very different narrative on nuclear issues. Ruhee, your thoughts on what are the common pitfalls that we get into when we're talking about what to do? I know elsewhere you've spoken about the problems with tokenism, for instance. How do we address this issue?
Yeah, I understand the need to have equal representation. It is something I support. But I think we must constantly be mindful of tokenism. I think also what tends to happen in certain cases is you just want to tick a box, whether it is participation in a conference or it is hiring practices. And if you are heading out with the intention of ticking a box, then you're not doing the background work necessary for you to get there to hire the best person for the role or have the best person seated at that table sharing their thoughts on a particular subject. And of course, in all of this, again, intersectionality becomes extremely crucial. And just to use the example of, let's say, hiring at a think tank. Now, we know that even as we are discussing these issues, and as we mentioned before, it's sort of taken off in India now, which is, accounting for gendered perspectives in the broader field of security studies. There is also similarly, or there should be similarly, an acknowledgement that the space is niche, elite, and primarily English speaking. And also, whether we are expressing ourselves in the written word or in speech, it is all in English. So now when you have that intersect with, let's say, class or caste, then you already have an invisible majority that is excluded from what you think are hiring best practices. So I would say a more nuanced, studied approach is absolutely critical. And to that, intersectionality becomes extremely important. And why people, I find, intersectionality has also become extremely politicized now. Whereas for me, it really just is an approach that helps me understand something that I'd like to examine a bit further better. And because of that politicization, or rather, it is the politicization is the result of how it is understood by, a large group of people. And instead of just seeing it as a way to look at how a whole group of people might be disenfranchised due to no fault of their own, the tendency is to see it as something that hinges on, rewarding victimhood. So, and I feel that perhaps even comes from a place of fear. So the tendency then is to sort of simplify or reduce it as a fluff or not a very serious approach to things. So really the problem is not with the concept itself, but really the application of it and the consequences that it can lead to in questioning structures of power. But here, I mean, at least in my own personal experience, I don't approach it as a political thing where I'm looking to completely overturn, like you, Jayita. I'm not a revolutionary. I'm really looking to just understand things better. And I don't see how this should threaten anyone. But of course, realistically, I understand these are completely entrenched systems. And if you're asking questions that connect what are otherwise completely separate fields of study and operation, it can make a lot of people uncomfortable. They are very used to these positions. They have been historically very used to these positions. Having said that, I think, just having this chat that we're having right now between just the three of us, that is a move in the right direction. I know that over the past year or so, there has been an intensification of these sorts of conversations. And, it reminds me of women's studies as a field, which, like the feminist perspective, tends to be completely sidelined. It's either that or, the philosophy classroom, which will have six women and perhaps that one token guy. So tokenism of any kind I'm opposed to, but if it is the result, having the right representation is the result of, a studied approach to what we consider an obstacle or a problem, then absolutely. Yeah, I think those are my thoughts, very jumbled thoughts so far.
No, I'm really glad that we sort of got two perspectives which are sort of connected but are also distinct, because Jayita spoke about the academic university space, and you spoke to the workplace policy space. And I see actually a lot of overlaps between how the two of you identify what the issue is and how the issue needs to be addressed. And in many ways, those issues sort of come back to how we are studying and approaching issues related to nuclear weapons or security in general. We're running out of time, and I actually would have loved to carry this conversation on, but just because we need to sort of put this within a time frame, I want to end this conversation by sort of asking each of you, do you think this is an interesting time to be a nuclear woman?
Yes, it could have not been a better time, because I see a lot of things are changing in the right direction. And I also see every time I'm in my classroom, my heart fills with hope and hope of change that I want to see. So yes, I think it's a great time to be alive. It's a great time to be a nuclear woman. I would end on this point that we need to decolonize the mind. I did not use the word decolonization a lot because I didn't want to come across as pitching my project. But a lot of the conversations we're having in terms of asking difficult questions and getting a bit of hard stares and just dealing with it with a smile and a shrug, right? Is really part of asking the hard questions. We can't ask them unless we decolonize the mind. Whether it's training our students, whether it's training our mentees, whether it's we are making them read Carol Cohn or whatever. But I think decolonizing the mind is the note that I want to end on in terms of making nuclear politics, nuclear policy a more inclusive and more meaningful place. Not just a woman from every part of India, but somebody who's really pushing the boundaries, people who are pushing the boundaries of knowledge.
Ruhee?
Wow. How do I top that?
It's hard. Really, really hard.
No, I absolutely agree. I'm actually very pleased that we are having these conversations. And I feel like, it doesn't matter if you are being able to get to the heart of the issue immediately. It is important that we're having the conversations and we're having them now, with a kind of frequency that ensures that it doesn't disappear completely from what are mainstream narratives. And, just this reminds me, when you speak of decolonizing the mind, Jayita, language is so critical. I have a background in literature, and I arrive with so many questions about how we use words and how we understand their meaning. And within my own organization, within our editorial practices, for instance, I've completely banned the word penetrate from certain contexts. It just, it's gone, and that's of course a matter of personal editorial preference, but it's
sorry to interrupt. I had to say another word. His seminal contribution to. Please.
This field is populated with terms that we use without thinking too much about what they mean and how they came into being in that particular context. And therefore, to continue having conversations, just around this subject and, how language is used and deployed for a particular purpose is very, very important. And I'm very glad to have been able to do this today. Thank you, Tanvi.
Thank you, Tanvi. Thank you, Ruhee. This has been an honor. It was so much fun to talk. Honor and fun. That's a rare combination.
No, this has been absolutely wonderful. I mean, I'm so glad we did this. Thank you so much, Jayita, for joining us right the first thing in the morning for you on a Monday morning. Thank you so much, Ruhee, for joining us this evening in India. I'm sure that we're going to have more conversations like this in times to come. And I agree with both of you. This is just the best time to be not just a nuclear woman, but an expert and an academic and a professional in this field. There's lots going on, and the two of you are doing such a marvelous job at your workplaces. I'm really looking forward to read and see what you're doing in the days and months and the years to come.